The Man in the Shadows, a true nightmare. It was a typical Friday evening for James Harper, a 28-year-old graphic designer who had recently moved to a small, quiet town in upstate New York. He had always enjoyed the slower pace of life away from the city, the chance to focus on his work, and to finally carve out some peace and quiet after years of chaos. Life in this town seemed idyllic: friendly neighbors, cozy cafes, and quiet streets. But something was about to change, and it all began with a dream. James had always been a sound sleeper. Rarely did he dream, and when he did, he could barely recall the details upon waking. But on this particular night, the dream felt more vivid than anything he had ever experienced. It was as though his subconscious mind had taken him to another place, and he could remember every last detail. The dream began innocuously enough. James found himself standing in a dark, unfamiliar forest. The trees were tall, their twisted branches creating a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Everything was shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. He could hear the distant rustling of leaves, but he couldn't see what was causing the movement. As he tried to move forward, his feet felt as though they were stuck in quicksand. Slowing his steps to a crawl, out of the fog emerged a figure, tall, with elongated limbs and a featureless face. The silhouette was barely human, standing unnaturally still, as though it was watching him. James froze. Every hair on his body stood on end as a wave of dread washed over him. The figure didn't move, but James felt an intense pressure in his chest, as if the entity's gaze alone could paralyze him with fear. Without warning, the figure began to move, gliding toward him with unnatural speed, as though it was being pulled by invisible strings. James tried to run, but his feet felt like lead. He was powerless, stuck in place as the figure came closer and closer. Just as it reached out with one impossibly long arm, James jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His heart pounding in his chest, it took him several minutes to catch his breath and calm down. It was just a nightmare, he told himself. Nothing more than a bad dream. But the lingering sense of unease wouldn't go away. The figure in the dream had felt too real, too vivid. And the way it moved, it wasn't something his mind could have conjured on its own. He was sure of it. Over the next few days, James tried to shake the dream off. He told himself that it was a product of stress, that his work had been overwhelming him lately, and his mind was simply processing it in the form of nightmares. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The figure had felt like more than just a figment of his imagination. It had felt alive. Then, the dreams started to happen every night. Each time, the setting was the same. The dark, fog-covered forest, the heavy air, and the feeling of being watched. The figure was always there, lurking in the distance, never saying a word, just staring. Every night, it would come closer and closer, until James would wake up in a panic, heart racing. What disturbed James most was that the figure never attacked him, never touched him. It simply got closer with each passing dream, its presence becoming more oppressive, its gaze more piercing. And every morning when he woke, he would feel more exhausted, as if the nightmares were slowly draining him. Weeks passed, and James's mental state deteriorated. He stopped sleeping well, haunted by the knowledge that each night the figure would return. He became paranoid, constantly checking over his shoulder during the day, certain that he could feel eyes on him. Even when no one was around, it wasn't long before the figure started appearing outside of his dreams. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, James returned to his small house, eager to get some rest, despite his fear of falling asleep. As he unlocked the front door, a chill ran down his spine, and he felt a sudden urge to turn around. His heart nearly stopped when he saw it, the figure, standing at the end of his driveway, barely visible in the shadows. It was exactly as it had appeared in his dreams, tall, featureless, and still. James blinked, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Was he hallucinating? Was he still asleep? But as much as he tried to convince himself that it wasn't real, the figure didn't disappear. It remained there, standing motionless. Watching him, he backed slowly into his house, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he locked every window and door in the house. What was happening? How could something from his nightmares be manifesting in the real world? He paced back and forth, his mind racing for answers. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, set him on edge. He kept checking the windows, expecting to see the figure peering in at him. But the hours passed, and the figure didn't return. Still, James couldn't shake the feeling that it was lurking somewhere nearby, just waiting for the right moment. The next morning, after another sleepless night, James reached out to a therapist. He explained the recurring nightmares and the figure he was now seeing while awake. The therapist suggested that James was experiencing sleep paralysis, a condition where the mind wakes up before the body, causing hallucinations that can seem terrifyingly real. For a moment, James felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this was all in his head, a trick of his mind playing on his exhaustion. But deep down, he knew that what he was seeing wasn't a hallucination. The figure wasn't just a creation of his subconscious. It was something else, something real. That night, the figure came closer than ever before. James had finally managed to fall asleep, though he knew it wouldn't last long. As soon as the dream began, he found himself back in the forest, the familiar fog rolling in, the oppressive atmosphere crushing him. And there it was, standing right in front of him this time, its blank face mere inches from his. James couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure reached out slowly, its bony fingers brushing against his chest. The touch was cold, like ice, and James felt a sharp, piercing pain radiating through his body. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His vision began to blur, and the world around him started to fade. When he woke up, the pain was still there, a dull ache spreading through his chest. He sat up, gasping for air, clutching at his shirt, only to find his skin cold and clammy. He rushed to the bathroom mirror, half expecting to see bruises or marks where the figure had touched him. But there was nothing. Physically, he was fine, but the fear in his eyes told a different story. James knew then that he couldn't keep living like this. The figure was getting stronger, crossing over from his dreams into the real world. It was no longer just a nightmare. It was something darker, something that had latched onto him, feeding off his fear. Desperate for answers, James began researching local folklore and paranormal occurrences, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening to him. What he discovered only deepened his fear. The town he had moved to had a long history of strange disappearances, dating back hundreds of years. Locals spoke of an entity that would appear in people's dreams, haunting them night after night until it eventually crossed over into the waking world. Those who saw it in both realms were never seen again. James felt a chill run down his spine as he read through the accounts, each one eerily similar to his own experiences. The figure, the dreams, the way it seemed to drain the life out of its victims. It all matched. And the worst part was, no one had ever been able to stop it. That night, James made a decision. He packed a bag and left town, driving through the night with no destination in mind, only the overwhelming urge to escape. He didn't care where he ended up, as long as it was far away from the figure that had been haunting him. But as he drove, exhaustion began to take its toll. His eyelids grew heavy, and despite his best efforts to stay awake, he felt himself drifting off. He pulled over to the side of the road, intending to rest for just a few minutes, but as soon as his eyes closed, the dream began again. This time, the figure wasn't standing in the distance. It was sitting in the passenger seat next to him. James jolted awake, his heart racing. He looked over, expecting to see the figure, but the seat was empty. He let out a shaky breath, trying to calm himself, but he knew the truth, and no matter how far he drove, no matter how fast he ran, the figure would always be with him. There was no escape. And as James looked in the rearview mirror, he saw it again, standing in the road behind him, waiting.